back to another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm Susie Selleck. Today we're in Batesville, Indiana at the St. Louis Catholic Church. I'm joined by Henry Picture. Henry, thank you for joining us today.
Susie, glad to be here.
So you are going to be telling us a little bit about this church, but let's talk first about when it was established.
Church was started construction in 1868. And it was a fairly small church at that time. There's been a lot of changes since then, as you can well imagine. There were 160 parishioners, 160 families that were registered at St. Louis Church at that point. In 1892, the church was much expanded. A steeple was added to the church at that point. There's a bell tower on the church, and there was a clock put in the bell tower, and the steeple was added to the church. And that steeple makes what is today St. Louis Church just a landmark in this city. You can see it from all over.
All over. I know.
Well, it's tall.
Yes, it's epic.
It's tall.
It's beautiful, too.
Highway 46 runs on the north side of Batesville. And if you turn off Highway 46 and turn onto the street, which is Walnut Street, and just look down the street, what you see is St. Louis Church. There's 15 small blocks between Highway 46 and St. Louis, and Walnut Street ends at the front door of St. Louis.
Yeah, it is beautiful, just that drive coming in.
You see it.
Yeah.
And you see that tall steeple. In 1892, the steeple was added. A clock was put in the bell tower, so the clock was added at that point. But probably most important, there's a 9.5-foot gold cross put on top of the steeple. If you look at the steeple, it's long and narrow and goes way, way up. And it's been there for a long, long time, and it will continue to be there for a long time. No question about it.
Henry, were there renovations made after 1892?
Well, 1892 was when that major renovation took place. Not much happened for the next, 60 years until 1961, 61 and 62. So over 60 years, not much happened.
Okay.
But in 1961 and 1962, the church was entirely renovated. They leveled the floor, they took out all the pews, redid the pews, just an entire redo of the church. But in 1962, Weberdings handled the job. They redid the stations around the walls in the church. And they did that from photographs of the original stations. These were ones that were made in 1961, 1962. They redid the altar, but the altar wasn't changed. This is the original altar that was done 150 years ago. Over the years, everything ages, and dirt and grime had gathered in the church. Smoke from incense and candles really takes a toll on a church. So everything was redone in 1961, 62, 63. The Weberdings folks rebuilt the altar, and what you see today is an altar that's moved forward, because with Vatican II, they stopped celebrating Mass at the main altar and moved the altar forward. The communion rails were taken out. There used to be a communion railing right along here. That's all changed. We've had several renovations since that 1961-62, but nothing nearly as dramatic as what was done in 1960, 61, 2, and 3. There was a renovation, it was probably around the year 2000.
Okay.
That was fairly major, because what you see today are two transepts on the sides of the church that didn't exist in the original church. The church wall was solid. Now what had happened, there was a shortage of priests, and the archdiocese decided that several parishes would be closed. And there were several parishes that were consolidated into other parishes.
Yeah.
And it was pretty well obvious that some of these parishioners at these smaller parishes would be traveling to St. Louis for Sunday Mass.
Right.
We needed more space. So they took out the walls at the front of the church, both sides, and built transepts. There's a story, though, that there was a couple that was ready to get married. Their wedding date was all selected. Everything was all set. They were to be married in 1962. It's Pat and Dennis Schrank is their names. They're parishioners of St. Louis Parish. And Pat was very upset because at that time scaffolding was all over the place. You could hardly see the main altar.
Right.
Big, tall scaffolds. She went crying to her mother and said, we just simply can't get married at St. Louis Church. Well, there was a solution. At that time, and you don't see them today, but at that time there were side altars in St. Louis Church. And the side altars were replicas of the main altar.
Right.
It was agreed that they would get married at the side altar, the Blessed Mother side altar, which was over here at this side, right here.
Okay.
Father Mahan was our pastor at that time.
Okay.
And he suggested to the parish that it would be a good idea if we had an adoration chapel. People didn't know what an adoration chapel was.
If you were to tell someone maybe today who didn't know what an adoration chapel was, maybe you could just define that very quickly before you go on.
Usually an adoration chapel is a separate little church, connected with the main church, but the Blessed Sacrament is present 24 hours a day at the adoration chapel. And people go into that chapel to pray, ask for special favors, special things that they want.
Is that where they light candles too?
Candles, so forth.
Okay.
So it's a sacred place.
Yeah.
It was agreed, the parish jumped on right away and said, yes, we ought to have an adoration chapel. Well, then they began a search for an altar for that chapel. Now, when the side altars were removed from St. Louis Church, Pat and Dennis Schrank went to the pastor and said, we were married in front of that Blessed Mother altar. We would appreciate it if we could have that altar. They are a farm family that live out here north of town, but it was agreed that the altar would be removed from church, intact, put on a trailer, pretty good size, and taken out to their farm. And the side altar was stored at their farm in an unused upstairs loft. And it stayed there for 17 years. When Father Mahan was looking around for an altar for the Adoration Chapel, Pat and Dennis came forward and said, we have the solution. We would give back to church. We would let that altar travel back to St. Louis. And if you go into the Adoration Chapel, and I'm sure you'll get a picture of it, what you will see is a side altar that's a replica of the main altar. That's what both of the side altars were. And Pat and Dennis gave back the altar that had been stored in their upstairs loft for 17 years. We've had a number of excellent pastors at St. Louis Church. Father Stan, whom you met here earlier,
yes, with Oliver,
has told me that we've had 41 pastors at St. Louis Church, 41 since 1868. And up until 1907, everything was done in German.
Yes.
The pastors had to speak German. The parish bulletin was in German. The sermons were delivered in German. The parish records were kept in German. So the pastors and the assistants at St. Louis Church had to be German-speaking priests that served at St. Louis. We were fortunate enough to have Franciscan priests from the time of the very beginning of the parish. And the Franciscan priests continued to serve St. Louis Church. And as I say, up until 1907, they were all German-speaking priests.
Now, at what point did you guys, now right around then, did it all transfer over to English?
It all transferred to English, probably pretty much overnight.
Right? Okay.
I mean, that's what happened with the German immigrants. They spoke German. My grandparents spoke German. My parents never did. But it was a fairly rapid transition when it happened. And it was driven, I guess, by society. People around, you know, you spoke English. That's all there was to it.
Henry, tell me about these stained glass windows.
They're beautiful, aren't they?
They are beautiful.
And they've been here since, as far as I know, since the original church was built in 1868. That's 150 years ago. What I remember about the stained glass windows is they used to open. And on hot days, the people, the ushers in church, would go around before Mass would start, and they'd pull the chains and open those stained glass windows. Wow. It was kind of an experience to watch them open those windows.
I don't think
they're sealed today.
Yeah.
They're there and they're protected. We don't want any stones to be thrown at them. We don't want any of the windows to be damaged.
Right.
I don't know where they were built. I suspect that they've been in this church because the walls of the church are the same that were here in 1868. So I think they've been here a long, long time. But I don't know who contributed for them. I don't know much about the construction of them, other than I remember them being opened and closed during Mass. on Sunday mornings.
Yeah.
And now we're air conditioned. You know, times have changed.
Fans and air conditioning. Yeah, you don't need
Didn't have that years
to pull them
ago.
open anymore.
Nope.
Yeah.
Nope. Tell you a little bit about the music.
Yeah.
The organ that we have has been here for many years. I don't know its origin other than the fact that I sing in the choir, and I appreciate the organ and I appreciate organ music. But when we got the grand piano, that's only been a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And our music director at that point went to Father, who was not a musician, who didn't know much about music, and said, we need an upgrade, we need some improvement. You don't. We had an old upright piano that stood over there in the corner.
Yeah.
They arranged for this grand piano to be shipped here from New York, and it has a beautiful sound to it, and we do appreciate having the piano along with the organ now. And I think, if anything, the music is appreciated by everybody, but I think it's more appreciated by the families. St. Louis Church right now has 1,100 families registered as families of the parish. And many of those families have, unlike other parishes, 5 and 6 children.
Yes.
If you come to St. Louis Church on a Sunday morning, middle of Sunday morning, you'll see throughout the church mom and dad with a number of children, not just 1 or 2, but there'll be 5 or 6 kids.
That's awesome.
We're known, St. Louis Parish, as a parish of large families.
Thank you for watching another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm Susie, and today we've been in Batesville, Indiana at the St. Louis Catholic Church, and I was talking with Henry. Henry, thank you again for coming out.
You're welcome, Susie.
And remember, travel slowly and stop often. Bye for now.